Howdy, howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review I Think You Should Leave Season 2. Going into this one, this season, slightly feels different because instead of having those, awkward scenes where you're just having this guy who's, looking at and, I'm doing this, just to see what you do, this season kind of very much relies on toilet humor or just to be shock value kind of thing, or it goes down roads where I'm just kind of okay, it obviously feels like they keep having the same kind of settings in this entire season. I'm switch it up a little bit, please. Come on. But it also just kind of feels like they are just recycling certain things over and over, and I'm just kind of okay. uh where it's not cycling the kind of skits, it's just kind of recycling some things to come back, where I'm just I didn't think that they needed to garner a second go at this. I'm why did this skit need to have a second part to it or whatever? I was just man, there were some funny spots in here, but I would also just say there's a lot of just cringe scenes also where you're just do they really need to I guess there was just some comedy that I just didn't quite get, but hey, it's difficult to write a comedy show. It's also just hey, we weren't expecting to get a first season, and so once the second season was a go, they're let's just put this out there. Even blah, blah. But if anything, we even have much more of Tim Robinson in this season compared to the first one, where it's I wish they could have split it up a little bit, where we didn't have to heavily rely on every bit of comedy coming from the the host of this himself, where it's just okay, in the first season we kind of split it up to just have this kind of just be skits among people, but then this whole entire season it comes even more focused on the host of this whole thing. I guess because there was no one else that could deliver it, or I guess they just didn't have as much stars in this season, I guess, as seasons past. Which, again, I'm not blaming that this show doesn't work because they don't have star power or SNL people or whatever. I just feel that it just kind of feels like the show has to rely on one person, and wouldn't it be nice to just kind of split it up a little bit so it doesn't feel like every scene has to be just one guy consistently. But yeah, this season didn't feel like they drastically changed the way they did things. They just kind of went to the same well. That's the only thing that I could probably say really left of this season. It just go to the same well. They do the same jokes. There's stuff that I didn't feel that I'm dude, I could have watched the first season and got a lot more laughs than in the second season, in all honesty. But comedy bits are hard. Freaking, shows are difficult to write for. You have to take so much freaking time to write all this stuff out, and what you think will work probably won't, or for a number of people, everybody has their own kind of taste buds, and maybe somebody laughed a lot more at this season compared to the first. Comment down below if you went through this season and you loved it better than the first, or whichever, or maybe you hated it. I don't know. So let's go into it. Let's go into some quick certain kind of things that eventually from real memory, and then I'll go into certain skits or episodes. So I think there were certain kind of skits that I did like in this show. We had like the Shark Tank kind of parody episode where we have these like people that go into this outlandish thing about like them like having so much money in their lives, and but uh and we'll get to that. There's also the scene about the woman in the car who has the tables. Like that's like eventually when you'll see that come up, you'll have a lot of fun with that one. Uh, we also have at some point we have I'll probably tell everybody which ones that I thought were funny. Um, we also have like a weird like baby kind of joke where a guy in his past life used to be just like uh, this piece of crap or whatever, and the baby realizes it. It's weird. Um, but yeah, so and those are probably most of the early episodes, and so probably once we get into the later ones, like I'll mention which ones I find funny, but people may not like my sense of humor. So, anyways, let's go on to that double five. Let's just go into spoilers. Let's go into it. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that having to spoil this episode. So the first skit that is to be in the first episode is to be about a guy who's just kind of being in his office and is to all of a sudden try and sneak a hot dog into his mouth. Like he's like going and kind of just putting his hand over his face to just try and eat a hot dog, but then he ends up choking on it. He ends up getting a Heimlich maneuver and he ends up like accidentally throwing up. And then the guy has the guff while in this office meeting to mention like, hey man, like why was this bag here? I could have fell, I could have tripped. Like whatever. So that transitions us to this show called the Corncom TV, where bizarrely they have this show that plays on a marathon called Coffin Drops. And so we just see like every single bit of this is just like somebody falling out of their coffin one way or the other, as if these coffins are severely flimsy, and everyone falls from the bottom of their coffins, and like that's just the skit. Sometimes the people are naked, sometimes they're clothed, but they continue to just repetitiously fall out of their coffins, and so this guy is to mention that's like, hey man, like it's not my fault that people didn't find this funny, and it's not my fault that my station is going to be non-existent just because I showed this one kind of show. So the next thing is to be this kind of like punked or pranked kind of show where we have this guy who ends up wanting to go out to a mall to prank people and do all these kinds of things to these people in this mall and just kind of be this like prankster or the guy that's kind of annoying everyone. And so the funny thing is this guy goes into so much like makeup and costume and whatever that eventually once the guy finally goes out to the mall, we have this guy who is to just realize that he can't do anything, that this makeup was far too much and he can't even breathe. And so it gets to the extreme measure where this guy is talking to the guys in the van who are mic'd up, and he's like, hey man, I can't do anything, like I can't breathe, like maybe I don't even want to live anymore. And like, so they're just like, okay, like, so you can't even do any little bit of something, you can't even like knock a table over, you can't kick a table, you can't do anything. And the guy is like, no, I can't even breathe, I want to rip this mask off, like I want to rip these arms off, I want to get out of this makeup, like I just can't breathe. And so eventually they're just like, oh, okay, I guess we'll just scrap this whole thing. And that's like the whole prank of it. It's just like all of a sudden you have this guy in way too much freaking makeup, And then it's like, dude, I'm not going to do any of this. The next thing is to have all of a sudden this one like seminar or something where all of a sudden we have these little buff boys competition where we obviously have a bunch of kids who are all wearing muscle suits, and so we have this speaker who, or this judge, or this host of this thing that is eventually going to try and pull one guy in to be this random judge of these kids. And this guy is like, I didn't expect for me to be doing this at all. And so this guy feels like this is extremely awkward. We have the host that is forcing everyone to clap to forcibly make this guy come up on stage. And so this guy is to eventually be forced to pick some kid, and like that's just how the thing ends. So the next thing is to have some ghost tour, where the ghost tour person is to tell everybody, hey, since we're all like adults here, we can like have much more adult language and stuff like that in this ghost tour. I'm like, why? Like, why do you need to like tell people like they can or cannot say something? But of course we have one person, I'm like, oh my god, this is gonna be the guy that takes it too far, and surefire enough. So we have this guy who just continues to come in here and keeps talking about like cum and like all kinds of stuff, like all kinds of like sex kind of things, and just continues to just go to the same well of asking like if ghosts can do certain kind of things that seem just very odd or whatever. And a lot of people are just like, you know what, like, could you just leave this group? Like, God, you're just like going at the same well over and over again, to the point where the ghost tour like guy grabs this person and tells him, it's like, hey, like, you can say adult language, but like keep it at your discretion. And so like I could lose my job. And so this guy, who eventually is crying now and is just like, but all I wanted to know, not to lose anyone's job at all or anything, but could the ghost just come? Like, I'm just like, good God. Just like, no, I need to know desperately. It's just like, God, what the is this? So the next, I think the next episode, I'm not gonna have perfect transitions for everything, because maybe I'll just be like, oh, it's the next episode, and then I might be wrong. We have this next thing called the corporate room, where it's to be some kind of Shark Tank show, but all of a sudden we just start to consistently like have this intro thing of all these people just kind of mentioning all of this stuff about like how they're so rich and how it like they weren't always rich or something like that, and it gets to this like goofy escalation of things where of course we have these people that are just saying these like weird stuff about them being rich, which was just like, good God, like these people are just like, I love them, but it's weird. So like that's like where it just goes. These like rich people just goofily mentioning things about how they like sold this odd stuff to eventually become rich, whatever. So pushing on, we have this other again meeting of these like corporate people, and we just have one guy who is just sitting on this couch, this like leather couch in this meeting. And so this whole meeting just becomes about this guy who ended up, instead of going and whatever money he was to get from this meeting, instead of putting it into like things like food or drinking or whatever, this guy took every bit of the money that he was going to get for this meeting and was crazily buying these shirts. and he went to this very specific store where all these like weird shirt patterns were there, and everybody was going crazy and wild for it. And like we have this like going like to be a second part skit where we just have this hotel advertisement, which eventually will show up later, about these guys going crazy over these shirts, like beating people up and grabbing these shirts like wild animals. But so our main character that's focused here is just like people are eventually saying it's like, dude, like go and eat food, like don't spend your money on all these shirts, like. And he's like, but I got it. And it's like, just go and eat, because I think he ended up injuring himself, which is the reason why he's on the couch, because I think he like broke his back or something. It was weird. So the next scene is to be about this guy who's taking his daughter to this, I think, restaurant. And so the kid is asking her father if they could have ice cream. And the father is like, well, I'm sorry, honey, but it seems like I don't think we can have ice cream because it's too hot out. So the ice cream machines just freeze up. And so all of a sudden we have Odenkirk, the guy from Better Call Saul and any number of things. Like recently he did the movie Nobody, where Odenkirk overhears this, and so he's just like, yeah, like, yeah, he's right, kid. Like, if anything, yeah, like, ice cream does freeze up in hot, like, times. Like, you can't get ice cream during this time. And then all of a sudden, like, Odenkirk is just be like, yeah, and me and your dad are friends. Like, we're really good friends. And so this guy is going on this rant about that he owns all these classic cars, and like, tell your daughter that I own all these classic cars. And the guy's like, yeah, he owns a lot of classic cars. Like, yeah, and tell her that I also have a wife and that we're best friends. Like, tell her all of this. And so, like, this just keeps going, but I can find myself laughing at this. So, like, I'm okay with it. And so this guy just continues to go to the same well, though, where he's just like, but yeah, like, tell her that I have triplets of all of these cars, like the Novas and then this and that. And so, like, it just gets to the point where I would have just wanted the guy to just admit, it's like, okay, honey, we can have ice cream. But no, like, he just doesn't give in. And then so Odenkirk just keeps going at that same well of having all these things. And that his wife is to be ill and dying right now, and that like Odenkirk is telling this guy, tell her that, tell her, like it's just like just nonstop, just continue to go at this. And I thought it was funny, but I was also just like, yeah, like one lie I guess can unravel into a number of other lies, to where like it's just pushing this guy to eventually just admit that he was lying to his daughter, but he didn't give in. So so the next thing is the hotel commercial about the shirts, which I just thought was like, why are we going to the same well? Did they need time to eat up? It was weird. So the next skit is to have this guy holding a baby, and the baby is to scream and cry while it's to be in his arms. And so the guy ends up handing off the baby and just be like, well, yeah, I'm sure the baby just realized in some part of my life that I was a piece of crap, and that's why, like, it hates me. And so it's like, no. And so the guy goes on this rant about how he used to have, like, this slick back hair, and how he used to be this, like, this douchebag of a guy, and, like, that's the reason why the baby hates him. And eventually we just get to the point where the guy is telling the mother of this kid, it's like, why can't this baby just accept that people can change. And so eventually there's also another guy that is holding a baby, and the baby starts crying, and it's like, oh, like, yeah, like, it's easy because this guy could like slick back his hair, and like that's the reason why, like, because I'm sure this guy used to have a certain life too. And then it just gets to the point where people are just like, you know what, how about we just like let's just have the baby go into another room or something, like. But the guy holding the baby is like, no, we need to give this baby back to this guy, and because the baby needs to know that people can change. And so the guy gets the baby, and then all of a sudden, like, he's imagining his previous life, and the baby's there kind of watching him, and like doing all these goofy things, like pouring water over his steak. And like the waiters are like running in to just be like, hey, you're putting water over your steak, how could you? It's like, and then we just have this baby looking over this guy in this beach where he's popping off champagne bottles, and I'm just like, what kind of horrible thing did this guy really do? I don't know. So pushing on. The next episode is to be about an old man who, like, we have these people going into this restaurant. They're talking about like this certain kind of colleges or something like that, and so all of a sudden we have these people who are to get their food, and we just have this old man. I don't want to. Anyways, we have this one man who is to eventually see this guy's plate, and he's like, "Oh man, I should have ordered that. Like, I should have got that." And then, weirdly, this guy continues to do things across the table with this guy's meal to forcibly just have this guy. It's like, well, hey, do you want my meal? Like, do you want this? Like, do you. Obviously, like, you're just not going to let it go. Because we have, like, the guy who's just kind of, like, grabbing at the. And then he's like, oh, I'm just joking. I'm just joking. Just joking. I'm joking. And so, all of a sudden, eventually, this guy goes and takes this burger and goes, and then puts it back on the plate to where it's just. I'm like, hey, buddy, do you want the food? Like, do you want to pay for that meal that you're going to freaking take from me? Like, and so, the guy just goes and just. After the guy just says, hey, do you just want the meal? And the guy's like, yeah, sure, like, I'll have it. And then he just eats it so much, like, he takes every little last bit of it and just like right in front of the guy, and just is like an enjoyment of it. I'm like, what was this skit? It's freaking hilarious, but it's also rude as F, and everybody hates that kind of thing. But I think that goes back to the one nacho thing, where they all of a sudden have this rule about nachos that they can't, like, share or whatever. Like, I think that goes back to that kind of skit, or I think they took that idea from that. So is every single season going to have some kind of, like, dinner etiquette kind of thing in each one of these? Who knows? But moving on. So the next skit is to be bizarrely this, like, movie trailer. And immediately once we saw the main actor was, I'm like, oh, okay, so this is obviously some, like goofy premise that they won't deliver to us for some weird reason until the very end. So this movie trailer is to be about this old man with this thick beard going around and, like, having this revenge movie and killing everybody and taking everyone out. And so towards the end of the trailer, we end up finding out that it's Santa Claus, and that he's Detective Crashmore, or Crashmore. I think it's Crashmore. And so, like, Santa Claus is basically going through and pulling off like like an action movie for some weird reason. And so I was just like, man, that is kind of funny. Like, it is kind of goofy to have that kind of concept, and I do kind of enjoy that kind of like weird humor where Santa Claus is trying to do something else with his career. Like, especially when looking at it, how he only works like one time of the year, supposedly. It's much better to have him kind of do something while he's not doing Christmas stuff. So, pushing on. So, uh, we have this thing called the Carver reputation vacuum thing, where this guy is going into this commercial, and it basically has like the very first skit of this episode to remind us of this guy who was choking on a hot dog. And so he ends up by like manufacturing this vacuum that is like an anti-choker that you can't choke on a hot dog while at your office, because man, if this guy would have had this like machine with him, he wouldn't have been able to choke on the vacuum or choke on the hot dog and whatever. So weird. Just like, this feels like a waste of time skit, but whatever. So now we have to go back to the Santa Claus skit thing, and so now Santa Claus is having this press junket where like he's to be interviewed by this one guy who is to start mentioning things about Christmas and stuff like that. And like Santa Claus is like, wait a minute, like, don't mention Christmas to me. Like, mention about my movie. Like, mention what I'm doing. Don't mention Christmas while I'm doing this. Like, if anything, I'm trying to like get information about this movie and blah blah. So we have this guy who just starts talking about his movie, and like it's just like, okay, like it's a funny skit, but like it's just like, okay, whatever. Anyways, pushing on. So all of a sudden we have a skit about like this office text chain where like these people are in court and having to question whether a girl said all this or not. And basically it's a huge gigantic rant about this guy who's to have like a hat on, and it's to be like a fedora or something. And so this guy Brian is to have this hat around the office, and people I guess are to like be so joking about all of this, and that's also to have them like joke about how this guy possibly has dice in his pocket, and like this guy is just the goofiest guy. And eventually we have this guy wearing this hat in this meeting, and his boss is telling him, hey, don't wear the hat in the meeting. And then the guy is trying to figure out a way to put the hat back on in the meeting. He's like, no, like, I'm going to wear this hat. Like, it looks good on me. And so eventually we have the guy who ends up dropping the hat, and bizarrely there's this like lubrication on this like wheelchair thing, that now this guy has like some kind of grease or some crap on his hat because of this wheelchair, and they're doing a whole scene about that. I'm like, okay, like this must have just been a killer of time. But like some parts about this were kind of funny. The whole like, we have a guy that is just trying to like stand out weirdly, or just has these things that people are just trying to figure out what are in his pockets weirdly. Okay. So the next skit is to be like the kind of funny, like we have this guy who's to be at this poker game, and we have this one guy who's to drink a lot of beer. And they're like, hey man, going for the record? And it's like, well, hey, if you had a wife like I had, then like you would probably drink up too. But then all of a sudden we find out that this guy is to get this acting gig, and he is to find out that it seems that every single one of his lines are being taken by some other actor named Jamie Taco. What a flimsy name, Jamie Taco. And so this guy is just like, hey, like this guy Jamie Taco is just taking all my lines. Like he's saying them just way quicker than I can, and so like I just can't get. And so his wife just gives him the confidence to just try and get them out faster. And so we have this guy who's doing this gangster scene with this Jamie Taco guy. And so while the guy is trying to say a certain portion of the line, like we have the other guy who just spits it out quicker. And so now, like, because like this guy went to Jamie Taco and said, "Hey, like, you do realize that not all of those lines are yours." And the kid is just like, "Well, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm just gonna say them quicker than everyone else is, so like I'll have more lines than anyone else will." And so once this guy finally has this one line, and how he just mentions like, "Yeah, like I only got the one line out." But like there's flowers given to him and all kinds of things, and how supposedly that one line is probably the best line out of the whole thing. So this guy goes back in the back, and so Jamie Taco is just like, "Well, hey, I'll get that line next time. I'll get it." And it's like, "Sure you will. Sure you will." So all of a sudden, bizarrely, we have this next scene that makes no sense to me, but like any one of these would have that same kind of thing. So we have these people at this one house that I guess they don't spend very much of time in. That this must be their third or fourth house or whatever. So all of a sudden, we just have this spot where we just have this guy who's trying to perform identically like the Blues Brothers, having the music on, and everything. And so all of a sudden, that causes this dog to continue to bark over and over and over. And so all of a sudden, we just have people that are just consistently just continuing to do things over and over and over and over again, up until finally we had the Blues Brothers guy who ends up stop doing what he's doing. He's like, "Oh, hey dog, like I'm not one of the Blues Brothers. I'm like just trying to do something like him." And it's anyways, whatever what that one was. So the next skit is to have a guy who ends up looking like he peed his pants a little bit because he didn't supposedly shake. So this is another one of those office skits. So, but it's in like this cubicle thing, so it looks technically different. So this one guy is to come out with a little trickle on his pants, and so bizarrely we have this guy who is to mention to this other coworker that mentions, "Hey man, you didn't shake, like it looks like you peed yourself." The one guy is like, "No, there's a whole website of pants that are to eventually just be this kind of like pants that looks like you just kind of pee yourself." So it's like a specific design and everything like that. And so this guy bought one of those at that company because I mentioned it to him. And so the guy is like, "Oh, okay. All right." So the one guy mentions is like, "I didn't buy that from that website." Like, "Yeah, I know, but like the website is just up there uh, so that way people like will can justify it's like, oh, he bought those pants." And then the guy's like, "Well, what would happen if anyone is to try and buy your pants like from this place?" It's like, "Well, they'll just say it's sold out." I'm like, "Well, yeah, that kind of makes a lot of sense." Like a lot of Amazon stuff just says like everything is just to be sold out or whatever. Anyways, so but also the guy eventually is to mention to the guy that got away with this, this peeing the pants. It's like, "But hey, but you have to donate to the site so that way it keeps it active. Like you consistently need to keep throwing money in so that way you can keep this site alive just in case you need it again." And it's like, "Well, what if I don't need it again?" It's like, "But you have to donate. You have to." And so it just gets to this whole skit where all of a sudden there's certain people who had donated and hadn't donated. And so this guy is like, all right, like I'll donate. Because eventually like this guy keeps going on and on about it, like going and forcibly having this guy watch this video in his office that is way too loud volume about certain wrestlers or something that beat up people because they didn't donate, and like it just goes on and on with this whole thing to eventually force this guy to want to donate, but I don't think it ever does. Like it's kind of like that skit on Family Guy where Stewie used to tell Brian, "Where's my money?" and eventually just gets to where like Brian got freaking like flamethrowered and all kinds of stuff until like Brian said, "Okay, here's finally the money." And so that kind of like that's kind of one episode. The next one is like in the very beginning of this episode, we bizarrely have a guy who's in a car but has no clue how to drive or anything about the car. So we have this guy who's just in the middle of this like parking lot, and so this guy's like, "Hey man, move your car," and the guy's like, "I don't know how." It's like, "Why are you in a car then?" He's like, so we have this guy is like, "Well, just like turn the steering wheel, just move, just go." And so the guy's just like, "No, man, like I don't know how." I'm like, so eventually, like he bumps the car horn and he gets scared because he's never heard of that before. He's like, "Oh my god!" He's like, "Wait a minute, how can you not know the car horn?" It's like, "Dude, I've never heard of it before." Like we just go on and on about this to where the guy could have just like pulled out or something and went the other direction or something, but he just was like going off with this guy about like, how are you in a car and you don't know anything about it? This makes no sense. It's like, just pull the levers, just do a thing, just do something. It's just like, God. So the next scene is to be this credit card roulette where all these people are to play this game of whoever is the one person that is to get picked. That one person is to pay the tab for everyone. And so we have this one guy who's like, "Man, I love this guy. Like, if anything, I love every single night that we go out and we have this fun and whatever." And so all of a sudden, we coincidentally got a bug freaking in my face. So we all of a sudden have this roulette, and it ends up that the one card that ends up getting picked up is the one guy that was saying like, "Man, I have so much fun with this kind of game," and then all of a sudden he ends up getting picked, and he's like, "No, I'm not going to pay." So this guy is getting this free ride like from everyone else. He's having a great time until he finally gets picked, and he's like, "No, I'm not paying. Like, no, I'm not going to do it." And so this guy like is coming up with no excuses, and then he realized he could have came up with an excuse, and he's just like, "Ah, man, I couldn't have just said that I don't want to pay. I could have came up with something else." Like, so that's that whole skit. So the next one, we bizarrely have this Johnny Carson impersonator that ends up going to this party, and so all of a sudden we find out that supposedly the pay way of which that they did this Johnny Carson thing, because the guy that does this company is there. Supposedly the pay of this Johnny Carson character is to all of a sudden like this Johnny Carson impersonator can hit people, just slap and like hit people randomly, because it's just like, well, that was the pay of which that you guys paid for, is just that this is a Carson that can hit people. If anything, these impersonators aren't actually all that good. They don't even really sound like people. It just feels like they have like one word that maybe sounds close. So this Jimmy Carson is just going around slapping people and hitting people towards like breaking things and all kinds of stuff. And they're just like, well, maybe like if we pay this guy, will we get him to stop hitting people? It's like, well, maybe. And then all of a sudden we just have other impersonators that come in like for free, and they start hitting people. And it's like, well, no, like you other two impersonators aren't the hitting kind of impersonators. Like like you can't do that. And so there's a whole skit about that. Weirdly enough, I kind of enjoyed that one, but it was also just like, okay, like we just have like these personators that actually aren't that good, whatever. So, uh, next up, we have this infomercial about the little buff boy, who used to be this little buff boy, and he ended up getting picked, and he ended up winning certain kind of regions. And so this much older guy, is to mention that he has this school lined up of little buff boys and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, like, all right. So the next thing after that is to just be this like weird date that eventually we have some monster on this wall that's kind of heckling the one guy that's on this date. And this whole scene to me is kind of flimsy. We have this one guy who has this girl who ends up dropping this one drink, and so he figures that this girl should get a free drink because like she had a drink that dropped on her, and it's like doesn't work that way. And so like, that was kind of a flimsy skit that I didn't really like. It was just stupid. The next one, we bizarrely have a guy that hires a guy that looks like his coworker at his office to go into toilets and like ruin them with his pooping. And I'm just like this skit just like doesn't have legs. And so we just go on to have this guy who just doesn't like his coworker, and so he goes into he has this double that goes into these offices and is to go in and just like have these like horrible poops. And so like we have where like supposedly the double is even better than the actual coworker himself, and so on. It's just a weird, silly skit that doesn't really go anywhere, but it's just weird. So pushing on. So this next skit is to be like this school where we have this car safety where it's like this old retro video. I'm gonna have to pause here for a second so I can do a reset. All right. So we have this car safety video that's like the teachers mention to the kids, it's like, hey, like this video will seem really old. If anything, like the scenes will be very goofy, but hey, just kind of roll with it. So it's to be about car safety, and so we all of a sudden have this teacher that tells these kids like, don't have any questions about these tables. And so the kids are just like, what? Like tables? Like what is he talking about? So we have this woman who is to take all these tables and to put them in the back of her car. And so she's to be really upset about why her like tables are all like just disgusting looking, or just like they look awful. And so we just have this woman who ends up going on and on about these tables, and then bizarrely at the end of the scene she just has this car accident that you can't really see what happens. And so the guy is just like all of a sudden like, okay, that's the first tape and we have like a couple others. And every single tape is to be the same woman who's eventually continuing to talk and gripe about her tables on how, like, something about Freddy Krueger and all these other, like, villainish, monsterish characters, and that she, like, she hates that they, like, have disrespected her tables. And then they're like, the students are starting to be like, Freddy Krueger? What? And the teacher's like, I don't want any questions. Like, don't question, like we have the people that are just like, wait a minute, like, what is her job? And it's like, don't ask me questions. Like, her job is tables. And they're like, wait, what? Like, what does that mean? And so eventually it gets to the point where we have this third video where we're to understand that I guess this woman is to like send out all these tables at these conventions or something, and that's like everyone is I guess just mistreating all of her tables, and so that's where she's to be upset about. And we have some guy that is going to be off driving off to the side, just kind of mention about her tables and how all these guys are like just treating them awful and all like so, and then we just still have this like last like bit of accident that this guy just can't take it anymore, and he rams into this woman so that way he can get to somewhere. And it's just like, what the are these videos? But I thought they were hilarious. The whole thing about the table where it kept just going on and on about the table, I'm just like, that actually was really funny. I actually liked that where it's just trying to figure it out or putting the puzzle together. I actually liked that kind of approach. Like, I don't care that it was one of those where they kind of like dragged it out or whatever. I thought that that was really funny. I like that kind of humor because I think like JonTron and stuff like that tried to do that kind of humor on his YouTube channel. Um, just kind of like making fun of like old fashioned videos or whatever. But anyways, pushing on. So we bizarrely had this Tammy Craps doll that these kids are to supposedly be a certain kind of size to deal with this Tammy Craps doll. You have this one kid who's to supposedly have to be like this certain kind of size, and so this girl puts rocks in her pants to eventually be able to get this Tammy Craps doll. She takes the rocks. She takes the rocks out of her pants, and so the one kid is to mention like, "Hey, like you shouldn't like cheat that you're like fatter than you are, or like you won't be able to handle this doll." And like it's just kind of like holding on to a cigar, and you have this kid like smoking a cigar, and just like, what the is this? What is this? What is a scene? But anyways, close to the ending here. Yeah, there's only 2 skits left. So the last one is bizarrely like all these people are at this meeting, and once their boss leaves, we just bizarrely have everybody playing pretend or playing around, and then like they're doing like horseplay, and then it bizarrely gets a little too rough because eventually one guy decides to tip this whole table over while somebody is like kind of surfing on it, and like all these people are bizarrely doing things like pretending they're creating this whirlwind with these 2 chairs and like all the goofy like things. And so all of a sudden, like after this guy gets hurt, we just have one guy who goes into this rant about how this one girl in the office like had her husband buy her pants or buy him pants, and they almost killed him. And so like he goes off about her husband being a much older guy, and it's like, oh, of course we understand why that she ended up hooking up with him, right? Because he's probably rich and so on and so forth. And so they go on and on about this for whatever reason. And like that's just the way the skit just ends, with just that, where it's just like, maybe you learned a lesson kind of thing. It's like, okay, whatever. So the next thing is to be at this place called Claire's, and so this Claire's thing is to eventually have these girls going in and needing to get their ears pierced for the first time, but they have to bizarrely watch this ear piercing video. We have this one adult guy who's like, why am I having to watch this video to get my ears pierced? This seems stupid. And so all of a sudden we have these kids just going on here talking about their ear piercings. And then we have this one old guy who is to mention about all of his like horrific things while getting his ear pierced. About how I think his wife ending up dying off and all these kinds of things, and how like he bizarrely needed this earring to go to Florida. And I'm just like, what is this? Like how we just have this like random person who's talking about his piercing and just goes on and on about other stuff along with his piercing, and how like his piercing could have quite killed him and all kinds of goofy stuff. And we just have this adult that's just like, I don't know why I'm watching this video. Like I'm just getting nothing out of this video. But eventually we just continue to go on and on about this, and these people just continue to watch this video. And then the thing, like, the show just ends. That's how season 2 ends, with just this weird video about Claire's and ear piercings and like weird send off of the show. But if anything, like I'm sure we were to get some kind of skit or whatever that seemed odd or goofy or whatever. But anyways, so yeah, that's all I wanted to say about this season. But I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.